today our speaker, Dr. Tankel from American University. He's an associate professor there. It's a great pleasure to hear from him because he truly is the expert on questions of counterterrorism and particularly partnerships on counterterrorism. And he has just written this book, With Us and Against Us, that he's going to talk to us about today. So it'll be very good, and you can see his bio in our announcements, his full bio. But just FYI, he's also written a very well-reviewed book about Lashkar-e-Taiba, an Islamist group in South Asia. So highly recommend that as well. But with that, Tankel, welcome. Thank you very much.
Plus, thank you for the kind introduction. Will, everybody here at the Clements Center and the Religious School, thank you so much for having me out here to Austin. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to get outside the Beltway and engage with all of you, which I am quite excited about. Also, so far, your food lives up to the reputation, so it's been great as well. I'm going to talk about counterterrorism cooperation today. Please just disregard the unclassified for instructional purposes only. I just realized belatedly, it's not in my bio, and I should never appear anywhere sort of publicly in my bio, but I'm still on the podcast?
Yes.
Never mind. Disregard that. Anyway.
His name is actually not Stephen.
Anyway, we'll just disregard that. Anyway, the title of the book pretty much, I think, gives away the theme, which is that most U.S. partners, and I think this applies beyond counterterrorism, but it is especially true when we were talking about combating terrorism, are both helpful to the United States in some respects and hurtful in others. Now, saying that partners are both with and against us is an important observation, but it of course begs the question, what can the United States then expect from its partners if they are simultaneously helpful in some areas and hurtful in others? And I would argue that answering that question is absolutely critical if we are to make the most of these partnerships, which is to say, if we are to optimize cooperation where it is good, to mitigate where it is bad, and where we are unlikely to see improvements, right? This is what we have to do to get that most out of that trade space in between. And so that's really the puzzle that I set out to deal with in the book, was what can we expect from our partners, and how can we get the most out of them, recognizing that these partnerships will never be perfect. Now, I should note that the book was coming out right around the time the national security strategy and the national defense strategy were all pointing towards the fact that U.S. foreign policy and security policy were shifting away from combating terrorism and towards great power competition. As somebody who has worked on counterterrorism for a long time, I can only say it is about time that we effected that shift. Combating terrorism should not be the primary driving force of our U.S. foreign and defense policy. At the same time, terrorism will remain a persistent challenge for the foreseeable future, and we cannot ignore it. If we ignore it at our peril, that's how we sort of get sucked back in and distracted from the wider issues of the day. And so I would submit that as we do try to pivot more towards great power competition, that requires us even more than over the last 17 years to know how we can get the most out of our partners, because we are going to be relying more on them. I'm going to talk briefly about the universe of partners that we were dealing with today. Then I'm going to go into what I see as some of the key factors that we should keep in mind in terms of how we think about these partnerships. Then I will posit a series of propositions about what we can actually expect in different areas of counterterrorism cooperation. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some implications and some recommendations for how we could get the most out of these partnerships. Very briefly, I was looking at partnerships with Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. I was focusing on cooperation primarily against Sunni Islamist terrorist organizations, which I will sometimes shorthand as jihadist organizations. I looked at 6 countries across these 3 regions. Some important similarities and differences between the 6 countries that I looked at. Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia are long-standing U.S. security cooperation partners. So we have security cooperation relationships with these 3 countries dating back decades. Counterterrorism became an increasingly important part of those security cooperation relationships after 9/11, but wasn't necessarily the only thing that we were working with those countries when it came to security cooperation. Algeria, Yemen, and Mali, the other 3 countries that I looked at, those are 3 countries with which the United States built security cooperation relationships after 9/11, primarily or really almost exclusively for the purposes of combating terrorist threats from Al-Qaeda and other jihadist organizations. So 3 long-standing partners and 3 new partners, which helps to sort of differentiate where the nature of the relationship and the history of the relationship is important in terms of what we can get out of these countries and where that is going to be less of a factor. All of these countries had jihadist movements on their soil at some point both before 9/11 and after 9/11. So one of the variables that I tried to control for was, do you have terrorists on your territory before 9/11 and after 9/11? Not necessarily consistently, but at some point before the attacks and at some point afterwards when we elevate the importance of counterterrorism cooperation. So I control for that while at the same time, like I said, looking at differences that may manifest in terms of our relationship with the partner in question. And then finally, again, 3 different regions so we can get a sense of where region-specific dynamics are and are not going to be important. So that's the universe of partners that I'm looking at. Let me now move to some of the key factors that I think are important in terms of how we look at these relationships. First, because we are talking about partners that had terrorist movements on their soil, right? And even if they had defeated them for a period of time, as Egypt had in the mid to late 1990s, we're still preoccupied with making sure that terrorists did not return, something that the Egyptians failed to do successfully. It means that we are looking at types of cooperation where terrorists we're focused on are external for the United States, but are internal for our partners. And that's a very, very important dynamic to recognize. And because it means that some of the areas where we are going to be seeking cooperation or where we are going to be trying to assist our partners gets into the internal dynamics within their countries. And this is somewhat different than we see in a lot of traditional alliance or partnership relationships, not, of course, entirely dissimilar from what we see in counterinsurgencies, where we are working with partners as we did in Vietnam, working with the South Vietnamese, or in Iraq or in Afghanistan. I should note that I did not select those countries where the United States had had a particularly large military footprint for a long period of time, because I was specifically interested in places where the United States is reliant on the partner government in question to be able to affect policies within its borders. And that's fundamentally different than what we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq over the last 17 years, or not necessarily 17 in Iraq, or in Vietnam as well, where the United States had more power and influence, if you will, by nature of the fact that we had such a large troop presence. In any event, what this means for our partners is that they have to balance relationships with us on the one hand, with their relationships with the terrorist groups that are the target of cooperation on the other hand, and beyond that, with their domestic politics, which is to say it's not just about the relationship with the terrorist group, but also how is that group perceived by the wider population? How is that group's cause perceived by the wider population? And what is that going to mean for the type of cooperation that our partners are willing to offer us? And I think recognizing that delicate balance that our partners have to play is important. It doesn't absolve them of responsibility for areas where they are hurtful to us or not as helpful as we want them to be. But I think it is important, if we want to get the most out of them, to practice what one colleague of mine referred to as strategic empathy, to understand where they are coming from. So with that in mind, it wouldn't be a social science book if I didn't have a couple of 2x2s. This is the first of two that I will throw at you. Talking about that balance, it's important to recognize both our partners' threat perception and our own threat perceptions with regards to both the terrorist groups in question, but also other threats in the neighborhood for our partners. One of the phrases that appears repeatedly in one form or another throughout various U.S. counterterrorism strategies, as well as other policy documents that talk about burden sharing or working by, with, and through other countries, is the concept of cooperation against shared threats. And, right, of course, in that upper right-hand quadrant, which is where we talk about U.S. and partners sharing a threat, that is obviously going to be our sweet spot for cooperation. If the U.S. prioritizes a threat highly and the partner does not, then we face an asymmetry of threat perceptions, as indicated in the lower right-hand quadrant. That is obviously going to make cooperation more difficult. We can be somewhat dismissive of the lower left-hand quadrant because the U.S. and the partner are both not alarmed, and so that's less of an issue. But I raise that point about shared threats because I would argue that that is necessary but not necessarily sufficient, and that we lack nuance when we talk about cooperation against just shared threats. Because what we overlook is that it's not just whether or not we and a partner share a threat, but also how we and that partner prioritize that threat relative to other threats, in this case, in the partner's neighborhood. And that's where that upper left-hand quadrant comes in, and the idea that a partner may face potential competing threats. And I'll just give you a couple of examples to show how that can complicate cooperation. So, under the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, the former Yemeni leader who is now deceased, circa 2010, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was arguably the greatest terrorist threat in the world to the United States. Core Al-Qaeda, which was based in Pakistan, was increasingly being degraded. AQAP had more capability, and it shared AQ Corps' intent to strike the United States. Okay? We remember the underwear bomber. There was also the printer cartridge plot. There were other plots that were thwarted as well. So that's the top terrorist threat in the world for the United States, based in Yemen. Well, the United States and the Saleh regime shared a threat from AQAP, but what was the top terrorist threat in the world for the United States, and certainly the top threat in Yemen for the United States, ran a distant third for the Saleh regime to the Houthi rebellion that was taking place. The Houthis are now the militants who control a considerable swath of the country in Yemen and receive some support from Iran. And after the Houthis, what was called the Al-Haraq movement, which was a southern separatist movement. So for Saleh, if he's ranking priorities, it's Houthis number one, Al-Haraq number two, AQAP at least third. And so that means that equipment and other defense articles, weapons, training, money, things that we are giving to the Saleh regime to be used against AQAP, he is trying to reorient to be able to use against the Houthis. There are instances in which his regime reached out to AQAP to try to cooperate with them against the Houthis. We have seen this more recently, where the United States works closely with the Emiratis on the ground in Yemen against AQAP, but the Emiratis are also more concerned about the Houthis and have given excess defense articles provided to them to AQAP-affiliated militias for use against the Houthis. So my point is, threat relative to other threats. This becomes even more important if that other threat is a close ally or partner of the United States. So US and Pakistan share a threat from the Pakistani Taliban, share a threat from AQ in that upper right-hand corner. But the United States has an increasingly close relationship with India, right? And an increasingly close relationship with Afghanistan, both of which would appear in the upper left-hand quadrant for the Pakistanis and are of bigger concern to them than AQAP or the Pakistani or anything else. And so that is going to inform how the Pakistanis prosecute their campaign and the type of cooperation that we are going to pursue. Excuse me. Which brings us to the second 2x2 I want to introduce you to, which is the partner's relationship with the terrorist group or the infrastructure that supports that group in question. And I've identified 4 different types of relationships that a partner may have with terrorist organizations. We like to think that terrorists are the bad guys, and actually there's a fair amount of fair number of scholars within the alliance literature who sort of talk about CT cooperation as a place that should be a natural area of cooperation for everybody because we can all agree that the terrorists are the bad guys. Well, actually, that is not true. We cannot all agree that the terrorists are the bad guys. In the upper left-hand quadrant, where a relationship is defined by belligerence, because a terrorist group poses a high threat and is not particularly useful to a partner, yes, they are the bad guys. Think about how the Egyptians view any jihadist group or organization. For them, the only good jihadist is a dead jihadist. Same with the Algerians, right? So both of those have belligerent relationships with the terrorist groups on their soil. But now we drop down to indifference. Well, that's how the regime in Mali, the government in Bamako, viewed Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which had carved out safe haven in northern Mali for many, many years. AQIM, in its previous incarnation as the Salafi Group for Preaching and Combat, arrives in northern Mali before 9/11, puts down roots, joins AQ, after 9/11. It's still got a large presence in Algeria. The Algerians view the GSPC/AQIM as a major threat. For Bamako, they're indifferent to that. They're like, well, they've never attacked us. We are, going back to that threat relative to others, much more concerned about Tuareg separatists in northern Mali than we are about AQIM. We don't really want to go into northern Mali to deal with these terrorists because then we're going to upset the delicate balance that we have with the Tuaregs. AQIM is just using this area for, sort of supply and logistics to prosecute their war in Algeria. This is the Algerians' problem. This isn't our problem. These guys aren't helpful to us necessarily, but they're not hurtful to us either. We are weak. We actually don't want to build capacity because then we have to use it. We're just going to kind of ignore them. Lower right-hand quadrant, collaboration. We have spent many years and many billions of dollars trying to convince the Pakistanis that they should view the Afghan Taliban, the Haqqani network, Lashkar-e-Taiba, as enemies of the state. And the Pakistanis have spent years sort of brushing us aside because for them, none of those groups attack the Pakistani state, and they don't want them to attack the Pakistani state. So they are not going to, if they turn their guns on the Taliban or the Haqqanis or LET, then those groups are going to turn their guns on the Pakistani state. And beyond that, they're useful. They're useful in Afghanistan. they're useful against India. And so they are state-allied organizations. They have a collaborative relationship with the Pakistani state. By the way, I could populate this entire graph with militant groups in Pakistan. Pakistan has all nature of relationships with various different groups. Finally, cooperative competition. A group poses a threat, but it is also potentially useful to you. Well, Pakistanis have had that relationship with various factions of the Pakistani Taliban that sometimes attacked the Pakistani state and sometimes got support from the Pakistani state to fight in Afghanistan. The Saleh regime had that relationship with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You are attacking us. You see you as a threat. It is also sometimes useful to you when you attack us because that reminds the United States that you're here and we get more security assistance. Right? We've tried to co-opt you. So we have to understand these different types of relationships exist. We can't just go in thinking, oh, there's terrorists in that country. We all agree they're bad, and we're all going to prioritize them the same way. Now let's move out. So those are some sort of overarching factors that and dynamics that I want everybody to keep in mind as we talk about how to manage our own expectations here in the United States with regard to what we can expect in terms of cooperation. Domestic counterterrorism, let me stop for 1 second. I am going to talk through 4 different types of cooperation. I've sort of bucketed them into different categories of cooperation based on what we can expect from our partners, the factors that influence the type of cooperation the United States is likely to receive, and the usefulness or lack of utility of our own instruments of statecraft. The first are domestic counterterrorism operations. And by domestic, I mean domestic to the partner in question, right? They're the tip of the spear. Remember, we're not talking about places where the United States has had large-scale forces. We are talking about places where the United States is primarily reliant on its partners to prosecute operations on the ground. And by that, I mean capture and kill terrorists, retake safe haven, destroy infrastructure in the way of safe houses, combat terrorist threat financing or recruitment, interdict foreign fighters. Here it is important to note that when we talk about conducting counterterrorism operations, that these can be conducted against individuals, against organizations, or against infrastructure. It is unlikely that you will have a terrorist group without a terrorist infrastructure on your soil, but it is possible to have a supportive or enabling infrastructure without necessarily having a group. Saudi Arabia, for a number of years, did not have robust jihadist organizations functioning on its soil, but there were plenty of networks that existed for raising money, for recruiting foreign fighters to go fight in other parts of the world, right? And so that's what I mean when I talk about infrastructure. And you can have an enabling infrastructure. One can have an enabling infrastructure without necessarily having a group. So we're talking about operations against groups and infrastructure here. So I'm just going to leave the eye chart up here for a moment. I'm not going to talk through every single one. I'm going to hit the high points while you read through it. Here's the bad news. U.S. instruments of statecraft are limited in terms of getting partners to conduct comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism operations against a group or infrastructure if they do not see that group of infrastructure as a threat. That is one of the hard-learned lessons of the last 18 years, is that no amount of security assistance or other incentives are going to change a partner's threat perceptions. If they see a group as threatening, they are more likely to act against it. If they see it as useful, they are less likely to act against it. And we can incentivize or pressure other countries into conducting sort of short-term, more one-off types of operations, but to get a real sustained, comprehensive campaign, that is an area where we have limited agency. It's always weird to talk about coercion when we're talking about cooperation until we realize that some of our key counterterrorism partners over the last couple of decades have been Pakistan and Yemen, right? And that we got cooperation to begin with after 9/11 by essentially saying you are with us or you are against us if you do not cooperate, right? The apocryphal story with Pakistanis is we'll bomb you back to the Stone Age. Coercion works for a limited period of time, but once a country starts cooperating, coercion loses its usefulness, right? You can't just keep that sort of Damocles dangling forever. And once cooperation of some variety is forthcoming, we become loath to lose it. And so there's a reverse leverage issue that comes into play, where we can only pressure our partners so much for fear of losing whatever cooperation they are already providing. So, okay, we're not happy, this is suboptimal, we want you to do more, or else. And they're sort of like, yeah, or else I stop providing you what I'm already providing you, right? And my pain tolerance is probably higher than your pain tolerance in the United States. And so we found that over time, coercive means are helpful for kind of kickstarting things, but not helpful for maintaining them. That's where incentives come into play. And the point here is that they're just not all that useful unless a partner shares our threat perceptions and doesn't see the group as useful. And in those cases, right, I would say that capacity building is very, very important. But this is not like Field of Dreams. Just because you build it does not mean they will come. And so we need to be mindful of that when we go around the world trying to build capacity, that you can build capacity, much, much more difficult to build political will among elites who are going to use that. You can build political will among forces. It's not the same as building it among, right, the elites who are in charge. Second element of cooperation that I want to speak about is what I call tactical cooperation. And this is sort of a catch-all phrase for different aspects of cooperation. I looked specifically at cooperation on detainees, giving us access to detainees, engaging in rendition or reverse rendition, providing reporting from detainee interrogations, providing detainees to the United States. After the Bush administration and then the Obama administration were trying to empty out Guantanamo Bay, cooperation on detainees also meant willingness to take detainees, or if they were from your country, willingness to allow them to be sent to a third country. So that's one aspect of tactical cooperation. A second is intelligence cooperation, which means intelligence sharing, but it also means acting on intelligence that is shared. It can mean joint collection of intelligence in some cases. It can mean allowing access to the United States for intelligence officers or for other types of sophisticated equipment that is useful for gathering information, not through sort of human intelligence, but through signals intercepts or other things of that nature. So a whole suite of activities in terms of intelligence cooperation. And then finally, access. Access for basing, access for overflight, access for supply lines. Think about, right, access through Pakistan into Afghanistan is how we have supplied U.S. and coalition forces there. And once the United States started conducting drone strikes, it also meant access for drone strikes. Legally, we hold that we are within our rights under international law to strike any individual anywhere in the world if that individual is a threat to the United States and the country where they are based is unwilling or unable to capture or kill them, right? As a matter of policy, our preference is that we have permission from that country before we start dropping ordnance there. And you can go pull the Washington Post stories about the deals that were done between the United States and the governments in Pakistan and in Yemen that were never publicized by the United States government, but were agreed upon in terms of the access that the United States would have to those strikes. Which doesn't mean that we've never done strikes without permission, but it does mean that that is our preference, and so that becomes another important form of access that we are seeking. So here's the good news. This is where instruments of statecraft are most useful. And there's a couple of, explanations that I think are worth pointing out here. The first is that the costs of providing this type of cooperation are lower for the partner, right? They're not necessarily being asked to send their own forces into harm's way or to resource domestic counterterrorism campaigns. These types of cooperation are also sometimes easier to obscure, right? So you can lie and say, we're not providing access for drone strikes. You don't publicize the fact that you're providing the United States with a base for drones. You don't publicize the fact that you are engaged in an intelligence cooperation relationship with the United States, or that you are doing rendition or reverse rendition or anything else. And so therefore, the potential for blowback for the partner is lower, right? And that's one of, so the costs are lower. These are also areas where partners can service relationships with the United States. So they can say, we are giving you these things, right? And it makes it harder for us to then push them in other areas. And we've seen this. I used to work at the Department of Defense on, Pakistan issues. I saw this firsthand where it's sort of like, we want to push the Pakistanis harder, and we don't want to lose our supply lines. There's a reverse leverage problem here, right? We are really sort of hemmed in terms of the degree to which we are prepared to push the envelope. It's also worth noting that historical relationships appear to matter here because we had long-standing basing agreements, right, or long-standing overflight agreements. Because our intel services had been working together for a longer time, and so we don't necessarily have to build trust. And it's interesting to know, for example, that threat perceptions matter here, and they can enhance tactical cooperation, but they don't guarantee it. The Algerian is an interesting case. The US and Algeria 100% shared a perception of the threat. It was the top priority for the Algerians, top priority for the United States. But there was not a lot of trust between the Algerian intelligence services and the US intelligence services. And so just because we had similar threat perceptions didn't necessarily mean that we were able to cooperate closely. I've talked to intelligence officers who told me that 2005, 2006, they're going to Algeria, and the Algerians are treating them like a counterintelligence threat rather than as a CT intelligence partner. And so that takes a long time to build those types of relationships. Conversely, right, have these relationships for a long time with the Egyptians, with the Saudis, had a history of working with the ISI in Pakistan that was easier to turn back on after 9/11. So that's going to matter there. And again, just to foot stomp it, this is an area where incentives that we are providing, security assistance, help in the political space, other stuff, is just more useful. Third area of counterterrorism cooperation is regional cooperation. None of these types of cooperation is new, right? We want you to participate in the military coalition. We want you to be part of regional initiatives. We want you to help us sort out diplomatically conflicts that are ongoing. I mean, this is like sort of bread and butter for alliances and partnerships for a long time. The difference is now it's done for counterterrorism purposes. The anti-ISIS coalition is the first coalition, to my knowledge, formed in the modern era against a non-state group, right, rather than against another state. Trying to end the conflicts in Yemen and Syria are important for a whole host of reasons, but in part because of the counterterrorism value that would accrue from that. Here, I would just note that that regional threat perceptions, as one would expect, matter a lot, and that where those threat perceptions align, strong bilateral relations, the provision of security assistance can help. I would also note that, as one would expect, right, going back to that, talking about balancing alliance dynamics with terrorist-state relations, that this is an area where I think we see a lot of the traditional problems related to alliance dynamics, free riding, which means, okay, you know, there's 5 different members of a coalition, and maybe one or two are sort of pulling their weight, and one more so, and a couple of others are kind of trying to just get by with doing as little as possible. Chain ganging, for those not familiar with the expression, means to try to pull another partner into your fight. So that's something the United States did after 9/11 on counterterrorism. We tried to pull people into our fights, but we've also had partners try to pull us into theirs. The United States is in Yemen today, in large part because when the Saudis intervened against the Houthis several years ago, they called up the National Security Council and they said, we are intervening in Yemen this week. You are either with us or against us. And we were split over whether or not to get on board. So, right, here we are. And I would just finally note, again, back to that point of threat relative to other threats that I mentioned earlier, partners will calibrate regional cooperation based on regional dynamics. And then we can play this to our advantage. So for example, the Algerians don't necessarily like to do a lot regionally. They view themselves as the regional headman, but they don't actually want to do a lot within the region that we might want them to. But hey, start talking about cooperating with Morocco to do stuff in the region, and the Algerians are like volunteering. Okay? So these are areas where we can sort of play this to our advantage a little bit. Finally, I believe it's called terrorism prevention now. It used to be called countering violent extremism, whatever you want to call it. Reasonably new field where we try to keep people from radicalizing or being recruited into terrorist organizations. We can talk about specific initiatives, countering ideology, counter narratives, address grievances at the local level. We can talk about CVE relevant, which is addressing broader socioeconomic disparities, problems related to governance, rule of law, all of the things that are necessary to kind of like, if you'll pardon the expression, drain the swamp of terrorists in said country. I do not have great news for you here. We have succeeded, I think, on the micro in some CVE-specific areas, but we've not had great success sort of on a more macro level, and I think there's a couple of explanations for this. One, we've never really agreed where we're going to focus, whether we're going to focus narrowly or more broadly. Two, our partners, at least in this part of the world, if they're threatened, will undertake CVE-specific initiatives, right? The Saudis have done it, the Pakistanis have done it, the Egyptians have done it, the Algerians have done it. None of them, no matter how much they're threatened, are willing to address sort of broader issues of governance, rule of law, socioeconomic disparities. For elites, it's just not, right? It's just not worth it for them. They'd rather have a terrorism problem than potentially see themselves, their families, their tribes, their clans lose access to money and other resources, or to lose power. And so, right, they're not going to do it. And then finally, we've never prioritized it. That's beginning to change. Congress is going to be marking up pretty soon the Global Fragility Act, which is designed to start looking at these issues through a fragile states lens in 6 countries or regions and look at how to address some of those issues. But that's a 5 to 10 year pilot project. So it's going to be a long time before we sort of get a sense of how to do this right, and we have to be committed to it. So finally, to conclude, how can we get more out of our partners? So the first thing, I'm going to give you some specific recommendations, but I want to start with a change in mindset. Right now, my understanding from talking to a lot of people who have done this on the planning side and the policy and strategy side is that we tend to look at things through a very threat-based prism. And by that I mean the United States sees a threat emerging, tries to understand that threat, tries to decide what is necessary to defeat that threat, creates a strategy to do that, and then goes to its partner and says, this is your role. And here's what we want from you, and here's what we're prepared to give you, and here's the capacity which we think we need to build for you. Or, hey, tell us what capacity you need to build to do this. We don't spend nearly as much mental energy, time, attention on the front end trying to understand all of those political dynamics that I've just gone through, right? So we try really hard to understand our enemies. We don't try as hard to understand our friends and what we can expect from them in terms of counterterrorism cooperation. So I'm not saying we should get rid of the threat-based paradigm. I'm just saying that we need to augment that with more time up front asking ourselves, and quite frankly, from a policymaker's perspective, asking the intelligence community, what can we reasonably expect partner X to do in this situation? How are they going to use the capacity building that we provide? What implications is that going to have on the political dynamics in that country? How could those implications possibly make the terrorism problem worse, right? We have to be asking those questions, and we have to be ready for the fact that we may not like the answers. And that the answers may be there's going to be very little that you can do to change their mind on X. And so that then means that we have to mitigate. And I can, I will say that is very, very hard for a policymaker to accept. We're always looking for ways where we can sort of like use as much leverage as possible. What is our agency here? Sometimes we just have to accept that our agency is going to be limited and work around this to the degree possible. Okay, that's fine. What it says underneath that is a couple of other specific areas that I want to talk about, which is how we can sort of expand the toolkit that we currently use when we engage in counterterrorism, and then finally things that we could do with some of our closer allies. Let me just sort of, I think I've talked through most of this, but let me just reiterate that we are, before I get into these more specific areas, that we are ultimately, and I cannot stress this enough, trying to combat political violence. Terrorism is political violence. You cannot take politics out of the equation. We tend to focus on the mechanics, right? And we've gotten very good over the last 18 years about the CT mechanics. But we still struggle with the politics. And so we need to be aware of those disconnects on threat perceptions. We need to be aware that countries, especially if our security cooperation relationships are built primarily for CT, are going to be worried about abandonment. We need to be aware that counterterrorism, and this is especially true today, is increasingly not the only thing that we are asking for from these partners. It's going to be a real challenge in parts of the Middle East and Africa where it's like, well, we want you to do more on counterterrorism, but we want to spend less here because we're competing with Russia and China and other parts of the world, but also we want you to buy all of our weapons and equipment, and we want you to make these changes to sort of keep the Russians or the Chinese at bay. But again, let us remind you, we want you to do more on counterterrorism, which you weren't predisposed to do to begin with, right? This is going to be increasingly challenging, and unless we recognize those challenges and plan for them accordingly, we are going to be disappointed. My sort of argument is better to be disappointed up front and plan for how to mitigate than to be overly optimistic and be disappointed on the back end. So what else can we do? One of the things that I would argue is that we've done a very, very poor job of conditioning assistance. We do this much better in the development space. We tend to just sort of hand over security assistance, and a lot of our planning around this is based on absorption capacity and sustainment. Don't get me wrong, absorptive capacity and sustainment are very, very important. But we also have to be looking at this with an eye towards, can we be using security assistance as a lever to try to promote reforms internally? Are there specific things we want you to do with this assistance that we can be baking into agreements, compacts that we forge up front? Right now, when we condition assistance, security assistance, our tendency is to provide said assistance, then decide we want the partner to make changes, and then say, well, if you don't do these things, we're going to withhold this assistance, which is negative, right? It's retroactive. Much better to decide in our planning process, here's what we can expect from our partners. Where are things where we could agree that if they took these steps, we would reward them with more assistance, right? That is treating them as a true partner. It is negotiating that out up front. I would also suggest we should be negotiating out up front. Look, here's what our red lines are. Here are the instances in which we're going to cut off assistance to you, just so that we're all clear and on the same page about this. Doing all of that up front would save ourselves probably some pain on the back end, and it also means that, right, it gets our partners on board, it gets bought in. We have a plan with metrics that we can assess over time to see how we're doing. Second thing I would say is that we do need new ways of putting pressure on our partners. Right now, we can wag our finger at you, right? We can threaten to designate you as state-sponsored terrorism. We don't have nearly as much in that space in between. What do you do about a country like Saudi Arabia that arguably continues to enable terrorists in some ways, but isn't outright supporting them? What do we do about a country like Pakistan that is actually supporting them, but that we still need to partner with? And so if we designate them as state-sponsored terrorism, we can't work with them anymore. I have various ideas in the book for how we could improve this. I'll give you one now, which is that we could take a page from the Financial Action Task Force, and which has a sort of grading system in terms of, are you guilty of money laundering or terrorist financing? And you can be on the gray list or you're on the black list. That we could have sort of different grading system where over time, we are, you're now on X list, right? We can also call it the gray list, and that doesn't come with any punitive measures, but now we're releasing, we're declassifying and releasing intelligence to show what bad behavior you're engaging in. That has a shaming aspect to it. It sends a warning to you that we are worried about your behavior, that if you don't engage in self-reform, then you may end up on the blacklist, and that will have some punitive measures. We're not going to end the relationship, but that's going to make things worse. And right, again, it gives partners time to find their own off-ramps, and it enables us to engage in sort of escalation of pressure rather than kind of this binary, like, we're very unhappy, or like, this is our blunt instrument of designation right now. I am an evangelist for assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. The fact that we do not conduct assessments up front, especially out of the State Department, DOD is increasingly doing this because Congress told them they had to, but out of the State Department, we do not conduct baseline assessments up front, that the National Counterterrorism Center does not conduct baseline assessments up front. For what we can expect and what we think will happen is especially jarring to me. And then we need to be monitoring to determine how these programs are working, and we need to be evaluating their effectiveness. Not to be too squishy about it, but we need to develop a theory of change with road marks and benchmarks along the way that tell us whether or not we are achieving the change that we would like to see. So that's something that I want to see at state. It's something that I want to see at NCTC. And quite frankly, it's something I think that the White House, any White House, when they're putting their CT strategies together, should have some sort of an aim and a framework as well. Finally, I just want to highlight, it is NATO's 70th anniversary this week. I am wearing my NATO cufflinks to celebrate. That we can do a better job of leveraging our NATO allies. We tend to think about this a lot in the military space, and that is true, but I don't think NATO is the only space for cooperation. I think that we have to be looking at how we work with NATO allies outside of NATO as well. And here I'm not talking about sort of mill-to-mill cooperation in a war zone, which we've seen is good but not always great. Certainly there could be improvements there. I'm not talking about direct cooperation in terms of like sharing of flight data or intelligence. We do that pretty well with our close European allies, with the Aussies and others. What I'm talking about is how do we do a better job of sharing the burden downrange? So how do we do a better job of cooperating not just with the French militarily, but also with the EU and other Europeans in Mali or the wider Sahel, right? How do we do a better job of coordinating multilateral funding, of ensuring that not just we're not overlapping with one another, but that the different programmatic activities we're engaged in actually complement one another. These are areas where I think we could do more. And I will just note, having been in Europe over the summer talking to a lot of people about this, that it is 18 years after 9/11, and we are probably still at a first principles perspective in terms of we don't have a common understanding, even with some of our close European allies, of the threat. We are more focused on groups. They are still focused more on individuals and networks. We don't have a common operating picture in terms of what the right counterterrorism instruments are. and we don't actually have agreement on what the right mechanisms are for trying to sort this out. And when I talk to people, what they will tell me is that right now, coordination essentially looks like all the different governments coming to the table, sitting down, saying, this is what we are doing, there now we have coordinated. And that is very different than a more coordinated planning process. I've had this conversation with people inside of the US government. They are appreciative of it, and they themselves have recognized this. And so this means for us, if we want other countries to share the burden, bringing some of those countries into the planning process earlier on, which is hard for us to do, but if we really, really want to get to sort of improved cooperation and burden sharing, then that's something that we need to consider. And if it's not something that we're willing to consider, then we need to kind of accept the fact that probably we are where we are in a lot of respects, and it's not going to get better, and we can bellyache about that all we want, and I think that's fine, but plan accordingly. That concludes sort of the talk portion of my talk, and I look forward to all of your sort of questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Regards to Mali, don't you believe it was an intelligence failure on our part? Because the reason I asked about Mali because of the beautiful jazz musicians that they have there.
Yeah.
And when the Tuaregs came back from protecting Gaddafi, you should have known that they were going to continue their campaign for independence. They were then co-opted by the jihadists.
Yeah.
And finally the French army came in, prevented from getting to Bamako.
Yeah.
Did we collaborate with France, the colonial power? And what have we learned from that? Because I believe that our maturity got to Africa is not the same as with Europe.
So I would say two things. One, it's worse than an intelligence failure. The Algerians actually told us before the U.S. went ahead, right, with NATO forces and others, and intervened in Libya. They said to us, if you intervene in Libya, the Tuaregs are going to come back and launch a separatist rebellion in Mali. Every time, right, something like this has happened in Libya, we've seen an outflow of Tuareg fighters who are there fighting with Gaddafi, who come back with weapons. They said to us, this will happen, and they were right. So, I mean, I talked to people in our own intelligence community who said, yeah, we were warned. They told us this was going to happen. We didn't listen to them, and it happened. That's number one. Number two, I would say that where we have ended up with the French is actually a reasonably good place in terms of burden sharing. Where we started wasn't so great. The French were intervening. We were not prepared to intervene. The Obama administration initially, because Obama was also upset about allies that don't sort of pull their weight, in NATO, did not want to provide refueling and airlift and other things, especially not if the French weren't going to pay for it up front. And we finally got over that, and we provided it to them. And I would say that probably US-French mill-to-mill and intel-to-intel cooperation is much closer now in Mali than anybody could have expected. It would be, 16 years after the, US invades Iraq and the French are, where the French are. So I think mill-to-mill this has worked much better. I don't think the French intervention is going great, but I think our cooperation with the French is going reasonably well. I think there's good lessons to be learned there, but I do still think this remains disconnected from wider political, diplomatic, socioeconomic engagement in the region. And that's where we've really struggled, and in part because that's really hard, right? Getting the Tuaregs to come to the table, getting Bamako to accept them, right? This goes back to the politics of the situation. But on the mill-to-mill side, yeah, and the French are very clearly in the lead in Mali, with the U.S. playing a supporting role, which I think is essential. Yes, sir.
Picking up on your last point about NATO and combining it with your earlier point about what a situation like in Yemen where the partner ranks terrorists lower than we would. Mm-hmm. How about something like Turkey, where there's no quite difference of opinion about who is a terrorist, i.e. the Kurds?
Yep. So Turkey is, I made a quick reference before to the fact that NATO is not necessarily the right mechanism for trying to improve coordination, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One is that it is a purely military body, and so all the different non-military aspects of CT would get left aside. But the other, quite frankly, is the presence of Turkey. That just getting on the same page in terms of counterterrorism cooperation is enormously challenging within NATO because Turkey is a NATO ally. That is a fact that, right, people who have looked at this issue widely recognize, which is one of the reasons why I've said that we need to find other mechanisms outside of NATO to improve coordination with certain NATO allies. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I find it absolutely fascinating that you went from writing one of the best books out there on how a state enables the growth of a terrorist group and uses it for its state purposes, obviously Lashkar-e-Taiba in India, to this study. There's a great link there.
Thank you.
But if I may move you back to
Sure.
the first book, having had that experience of analyzing
Yep.
the emergence of a lethal terrorist group out of chaos, what are we not looking at around the globe? Where should we be looking for the next issue, terrorist issue, that we're not paying attention to today?
So I would say a couple things. One, I think I don't think it's a question of where we're not paying attention today. I think we have a tendency sometimes to treat terrorist threats like small kids playing soccer, which is to say that everybody runs to the ball, right? And so I think we did that to a degree with the Islamic State. I think we are rebalancing off of that now. I think there's real questions about what South Asia will look like, depending on where negotiations come out between the U.S. and the Taliban and the Afghan government. And I think that the intelligence community is probably cognizant of that. I don't know that sort of from a policymaker's perspective we are. I think we can. I think the other point that I would make is that there's no question that that people recognize the importance of remaining focused on Iraq and Syria, but I would just stress that, yes, we need to remain focused on Iraq and Syria. I don't think geographically there's an area where we're not necessarily focused. I would say that outside of Islamist terrorism, I think one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is the growth of white nationalist terrorism. As a global movement, this has been historically seen as a domestic problem for us and one that we have not necessarily paid a lot of attention to. I think it is very clear that although, one doesn't want to overly analogize what we saw with the jihadist movement to the white nationalist movement, that the ability to take advantage of internet and social media, of technology, to promote attacks and then to advertise them, right? A lot of the problems that we had with sort of the Islamic State from, in regards to its ability to inspire and sometimes then to sort of direct lone wolf attacks is something I think we should be keeping an eye on as the white nationalist terrorist movement appears increasingly international. I think that's much more complicated because, ideologically, it's a much more fraught debate here in the United States. But I can tell you that I think it's something that we need to be mindful of, not least because, from my perspective, I think this is something, if one goes back to the idea of terrorism as political violence, it politically is so much more divisive. It has the potential to be so much more divisive for us and for our Western allies around the world, that if we don't sort of get ahead of this, there are going to be real problems. I am not an expert in the area, but I think the other thing to be mindful of is the role that that Russia has or has not played in stoking some of these far-right movements, and that is also something that I think we need to not over respond to, but be cognizant of and just get better fidelity on. And so that is something that I think that we need to be looking at or paying attention to more closely. I've been saying that and writing that for a while, so we'll see. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on kind of like this shift that we're seeing right now of taking resources from the CT fight towards great power competition, and specifically looking at the issue of the foreign fighters.
Yeah.
Is this an issue the United States should rely on our typical counterterrorism partners on to help resolve? And if not, is this an opportunity to shift maybe towards more Central Asian partners and looking towards what we can work with Kazakhs or with looking at Turkmenistan as kind of potential counterterrorism partners and dealing with
Are you talking about in terms of returning foreign fighters and how to deal with them?
returning foreign fighters, and then also just on kind of recalibrating our CT posture in like great power competition?
Yeah, so let me take them separately. So on foreign fighters, we have no choice but to work with other countries because they have to go somewhere, right? And I think one of the challenges that we have had is that we don't want them, right? We want other countries to accept their foreign fighter returnees, but we don't want to necessarily accept our own. And the Europeans really don't want these people coming back. And at the same time, nobody, right? The Kurds can't hold on to them forever, and we are going to have a real problem if, right, they just start taking people out if our closest partners in the region just start taking people out and, shooting them and dumping them in mass graves, nor do we want them necessarily all handed over to the Assad regime. So finding some way ahead on this is absolutely critical. This is as political and legal as it gets, and we have no choice but to work with other countries on this. There are some things that we could be doing, which we I think are already doing in terms of making battlefield intelligence available for prosecution, working on, I think the UN and international lawyers have been doing some good work in terms of, kind of reforming the legal system so that, we can prosecute. But it also means countries have to decide what they're going to do with people when they come home in terms of rehabilitation, incarceration, what have you. And there's just no way around that. You have to work with other countries on this. On great power competition, my approach to this has always been less about what our objectives should be for counterterrorism and more about being clear about what our objectives are for counterterrorism. So if our objective is defeat X group, then we need to be cognizant of the costs entailed in that and the trade-offs when we are dealing with sort of other elements of geopolitics. If it is just contain said group, then that is, then that maybe gives us some more space. But I think that there has been a considerable delta between our stated objectives and sometimes, the actual resources that we're prepared to put behind this. And I think that is only going to grow as we pivot back to great power competition. So my argument is that I think we need to be much more clear, especially in the Middle East and Africa, what it is that we are looking to get out of those regions writ large, And I would say, and what I have said is our aim to contain security threats there so that we could focus on other regions? Is our aim to compete with the Russians and the Chinese within those regions, and that is going to be the driving force of our engagement there? Are we going to, and on what grounds are we going to compete, and are we going to compete everywhere, and figure out what our overall sort of framework is for a given region, and then determine where counterterrorism fits in, If your goal is just, I want to contain stuff here so I can work somewhere else, then you have a different approach on counterterrorism than if I want to compete really hard in this region, and CT can either be a distraction or it can actually be a way for continued and ongoing engagement and complementary to sort of our, the ways in which we're competing with other great powers. We have to make that determination. I'm trying to make sure I get it. Yeah.
So you talked about Yemen and Pakistan, about problematic partners who also tend to cooperate when it comes to terrorists because they see them as useful. But what are the options for dealing with countries where the U.S. perceives them as terrorist groups, but they're in fact, deeply ingrained in their country's political systems, like say Hezbollah in Lebanon.
There's no satisfactory solution for us, sadly, right, at the end of the day. I think the unsatisfactory solution in some of these cases, once they're so ingrained, is to slowly move them away from terrorism towards being legit political actors. I think the issue with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I'm not a Hezbollah expert, but I've also seen this with militant groups in Pakistan, is that these are organizations that have not at this point been forced to choose between being involved in terrorism and militancy and being involved in politics. That's always been my problem with mainstreaming groups in Pakistan, is I'm sort of like, but you're not mainstreaming them. You're just letting terrorist organizations get involved in politics. You're not forcing them to choose. Now, I think it is unsatisfactory for us if some of these groups go mainstream. And I think it would be very, very hard for the United States to ever sort of own that as a stated objective, right? Like these are, take my old hobby horse Lashkar-e-Taiba. Like our stated position can't be, sure, Lashkar-e-Taiba can be part of the political fabric of Pakistan as long as it gives up terrorism, because it's been involved in far too many terrorist activities that is not, I think, easy to sell on a global policy scale. But can our unstated position be that that would be acceptable to us, right, if they actually gave up militancy? Yeah, I think that's something we should be considering. But that's still, we have to, I have not seen much evidence that entities are actually moving in those directions. There's a hand over there, yeah.
So, from the recent moves by the Trump administration to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel and their overt, strong alliance with Israel, do you see any kind of impact that has on our counterterrorism alliances in the Middle East and any of those are antagonistic towards Israel?
So actually, I don't think it's good policy. I want to be very clear. I think it's bad policy for a whole host of reasons. I'm not necessarily sure it hurts us in terms of counterterrorism cooperation with countries like. I think it hurts us with. I think that the fundamentals of our cooperation with countries like Jordan are strong enough that I think this made Jordan's life harder. I think we made things harder for our partner, but I don't think it's necessarily going to impair counterterrorism cooperation for the Jordanians, for example. And I mention them because of their large Palestinian population. I do think it potentially threatens, right, or increases the threat of instability in Jordan. Do I think it hurts CT cooperation with like the Saudis or the UAE or the Egyptians? Not really. I mean, like the Egyptians have closer security cooperation with the Israelis than they do with us at this point. Like, the Israelis are helping them, right, build their military. Like it's the fact that, this is an aside, but like the fact that we're still like, sort of paying off the Egyptians to stay in a peace treaty with a close security partner is sort of absurd to me. And so I think we're actually in a place now where a lot of these countries are working with the Israelis closely enough that, it's not necessarily going to impact us from a day-to-day CT perspective. Again, I think where we will see impact is in the impacts on stability within some of these countries.
Last one.
Yeah. Good. All right. Here we go. Yes, sir.
You've provided, Professor Tankel, a very fascinating, complete analytical framework.
Thank you.
Which leads to a methodology of action. I'd like to just present a scenario and ask you how your methodology would respond to this issue.
Sure.
The UAE and the United States are allies. The UAE and the United States both consider Al-Qaeda to be a bad guy.
Yep.
The UAE has the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa. Knocking the Burj Khalifa down is simpler than knocking the Twin Towers down.
Okay.
The UAE, although it is our ally and knows we don't like Al-Qaeda, is paying Al-Qaeda to not knock down the Burj Khalifa. How does the United States, knowing that the money that's going from the UAE to Al-Qaeda is strengthening our joint enemy, in your methodology, handle how the United States should handle the issue?
That's a great question. And it's not just that, right? It's the UAE has been giving weapons to AQAP-affiliated militias in Yemen, right, according to CNN. I think the answer to that question depends in part on what it is that we want to get out of the UAE. I'm not trying to like sort of dodge the question. What I would say is the money that is going to Al-Qaeda, right, is that helpful enough, and is the threat high enough for the UAE that if they stop their given practices, we are faced with a bigger challenge, and our ally or partner is faced with a bigger challenge. How much leverage do we have over them given the other areas that are, right, important but also sometimes problematic in the relationship, both what's happening on the ground in Yemen. I mentioned the militias, right? They were running secret prisons there where there was torture reportedly ongoing. There are reports that the UAE has been hiring people to spy, not right from our government, former government contractors, not just to spy on their own people, but possibly to spy on us as well, right? So they're a partner, but they're a partner that engages in a lot of, right, potentially unhelpful activities as well. And so to my mind, we don't just look at this in a vacuum and say, well, this one activity is bad. We sort of look at all of the things that we're getting from the relationship and that we want to continue to get from the relationship. We recognize that this relationship is always going to be a difficult, problematic relationship. And we ask ourselves, what are the areas where I think it is most, their activities are most hurtful, and where we have the best chance of changing that behavior with sort of the limited costs to us or to our partner, and focus on that and mitigate elsewhere.
Okay, great.
Pretty
Please join me.
perfect.
Thank you.